Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
Chapter 1. Birth of the MIGs. Before the name, Tommy Robinson became known in football circles, before the stories, the arrests, and the clashes that would later define a reputation, there was simply a group of lads growing up in Luton, drawn together by football, loyalty, and a growing fascination with the culture that surrounded the terraces. This story is about the original Tommy Robinson. A central figure within the Luton MIGs, a football firm that carved its name into the history of English hooligan culture. This is not about the later public figures who adopted the same name years afterward, but about the man who stood shoulder to shoulder with his mates during one of the most volatile periods English football had ever seen. Back then, the seeds of what would become the MIGs were planted long before anyone realised just how far things would go. Like many lads growing up in Luton during the 1980s, football wasn't just something you watched, it was something you lived. Saturdays weren't about sitting at home, they were about movement, noise, crowds, tension, and belonging to something bigger than yourself. The atmosphere around football grounds in those days carried an energy that was impossible to ignore. It was tribal, territorial, and for young lads looking for identity, it offered a sense of purpose. For Tommy and the others, the influence didn't just come from the terraces themselves. One of the defining moments came when they watched a documentary about the culture surrounding clubs like West Ham. That film opened their eyes to something new, a glimpse into organised groups, loyalty between members, and the reputation that came with standing firm among your own. That moment lit a spark. The idea of forming something of their own didn't happen overnight, but once the thought had taken hold, it spread quickly among the group. They were still schoolboys at the time, but the mindset was already forming, a belief that football wasn't just about the match, but about the journey, the territory, and the statement made by those willing to stand their ground. The name that would eventually define them came from an unlikely source: military aircraft. The MiG fighter jet. Fast, aggressive, powerful, and feared, the image of the MiG aircraft carried weight. It symbolized strength, speed, and precision. It felt right for what they wanted to represent. The name stuck almost immediately, and with it came the early identity that would later become known across the football landscape. They called themselves the MIGs. At first, it was just a name between mates, something shared quietly among those who understood what it meant. But names carry weight, and once that identity began to take hold, it started shaping behaviour. The lads began seeing themselves differently. They weren't just spectators anymore, they were part of something forming, something that demanded loyalty and presence. School life continued, but football slowly began to dominate conversations, plans, and ambitions. Weekends were discussed days in advance, fixtures were studied, travel plans were considered. Even before they were fully established, the sense of anticipation around away games became a driving force. It wasn't long before the group began testing themselves. Away trips were where reputations were built. Anyone could shout from the comfort of their own ground, but stepping into unfamiliar territory was something else entirely. It took nerve, numbers, and trust in the people standing beside you. Those early journeys weren't glamorous. They There were no luxuries, no organised travel, and certainly no guarantees. It was about scraping together money, planning routes, and making decisions that often carried risk. But that risk was part of the appeal. For many young lads at the time, football away days were as much about adventure as they were about loyalty. The feeling of stepping into another town, surrounded by rival colours and hostile faces, created an atmosphere that sharpened the senses. Every movement mattered. Every glance could mean something. The MIGs were still finding their identity, but the foundation was already being laid. Friendships became stronger under pressure. Trust was built through shared experiences, long journeys, tense encounters, and the constant awareness that anything could happen without warning. Among the group were individuals who would later become known names within the firm, figures like Windy, Flower, Trigger, and others whose presence helped shape the character of the MIGs. Each man brought something different. Some carried natural confidence. Others possessed the kind of quiet determination that only revealed itself when things became serious. Tommy quickly found himself drawn deeper into that environment. He wasn't just watching from the outside. He was learning, observing, and absorbing the unwritten rules that governed firm life. There was a code, one that valued loyalty above everything else. Turning your back on your mates wasn't tolerated. Standing firm, even when outnumbered, was expected. Reputation mattered. Word travelled fast in those days. One strong showing could build respect, but one moment of hesitation could linger far longer. That knowledge shaped behaviour. It forced lads to measure themselves against the expectations of the group. The early days weren't about domination, they were about survival, proving that you belonged, that you could be trusted, that you wouldn't fold when pressure arrived. Gradually, the numbers began to grow. More lads from Luton started hearing about the group. Some were drawn by curiosity, others were pulled in by reputation. The MIG name, once just a quiet reference among school friends, began spreading beyond its original circle. With growth came confidence, and with confidence came risk. By the time they began making regular away journeys, the group had developed a rhythm, meeting points, travel habits, shared expectations. It wasn't formal, but it was structured enough to hold together when tension rose. These early trips were lessons in awareness. You learned quickly how to read situations, how to judge numbers, how to recognize when things were about to turn, and when to stand firm. Experience became the greatest teacher. Every journey added knowledge. Every encounter shaped the next decision. It was during this period that the MIG identity truly began to form. Not just as a name, but as a presence. Other firms started noticing them. Not immediately as a major force, but as a group willing to travel, willing to stand, and willing to test themselves in unfamiliar territory. That reputation didn't arrive overnight. It was built slowly, trip by trip, decision by decision, and with each journey, the stakes grew higher. The excitement that once surrounded simple travel began to shift into something more serious. The tension before arrival in rival towns became heavier. Conversations grew quieter. Focus sharpened. This wasn't just adventure anymore, it was becoming a way of life. By the time the MIGs entered their next phase, they were no longer simply a group of curious lads exploring football culture. They were becoming a recognised presence, a firm learning how to operate, how to move together, and how to face opposition without hesitation. And it was during one particular away trip, a journey that would later become one of the most talked about early experiences, that the lessons of loyalty, fear, and pride would come sharply into focus. That journey was to Reading, and what happened there would leave a lasting impression on everyone involved. By the time the journey to Reading came around, the MIGs were no longer just a group experimenting with away travel. They were beginning to understand what came with the territory, tension, risk, and the constant possibility that things could turn serious without warning. Reading was one of those trips that stuck in the memory. It wasn't just another fixture, it became a lesson, one that exposed the difference between confidence and reality. Among those travelling that day was a lad known as Gaz. Like many at that stage, he carried himself with confidence. In the build-up to the trip, he talked a good game, giving the impression that he was more than ready for whatever might come. There was bravado, the kind that often filled conversations before an away day, when nerves were masked by loud voices and bold statements. Everyone had heard it before, the promises, the confidence, the certainty that nothing would shake them. But away days had a way of revealing truth. The journey itself followed the usual pattern. Meeting points were arranged, travel sorted, and numbers gathered. There was a sense of anticipation building among the lads. Conversations bounced between humour and focus. Some joked, others stayed quiet, lost in their own thoughts. There was always that moment, the quiet stretch before arrival, when reality began to settle in. As they moved closer to Reading territory, the mood shifted. Laughter faded slightly, attention sharpened, eyes stayed alert. You learned quickly that arriving in another town meant stepping into unknown ground where the smallest detail could mean the difference between control and chaos. Once inside the town, the tension became clearer. There were rival faces around, unfamiliar figures watching movements, sizing up numbers. Every step carried weight. Every corner held possibility. For Gaz, this was where things began to change. The earlier confidence that filled his words started to fade. What had once sounded convincing now felt uncertain. The bravado that came so easily before departure didn't carry the same strength once reality stood directly in front of him. It happens to many at some point, that moment when the noise in your head becomes louder than the noise around you. The MIGs moved through the area with purpose, staying tight, watching everything. Situations didn't always explode into action, but the threat was always there. That was enough to test anyone's nerve. As tension increased, Gaz's behaviour shifted further. He became quieter, less certain. The sharp edge that once defined his voice softened into hesitation. Those closest to him noticed it immediately. In that environment, changes in behaviour didn't go unnoticed. Confidence wasn't measured in words, it was measured in presence. At one point during the day, as pressure mounted and the possibility of confrontation loomed, Gaz made a decision that would stay with the group long after the trip ended. Instead of holding position with the others, he pulled away. He created distance. What started as hesitation turned into withdrawal, and withdrawal became absence. In a culture built on standing shoulder to shoulder, That kind of movement spoke louder than anything he had said before the trip began. The group noticed, not immediately with anger, but with understanding, because moments like that revealed character. For Tommy and the others, the reading trip became more than just another away day. It became a moment of clarity, a reminder that not everyone who talked tough before departure could hold steady when pressure arrived. When the group returned from Reading, the atmosphere carried a different tone. There was reflection, quiet conversations about what had happened, about who stood firm and who didn't. The trip had stripped away illusions. It showed exactly how quickly confidence could crumble when reality took hold. Gaz returned as well, but something had changed. In the days that followed, he tried to present the trip differently, speaking as though he had remained part of the action, as though nothing had shaken him. But those who had been there knew the truth. They had seen the moment unfold. They had watched confidence dissolve into hesitation. Reputation within a firm wasn't built on claims. It was built on actions witnessed by others. And reading had provided one of the earliest lessons in that reality. For Tommy, the trip reinforced something fundamental. Loyalty mattered more than bravado. Talking meant nothing without presence. Standing beside your mates when tension peaked was the only currency that held value. From that day forward, the expectations within the MIGs became clearer. If you travelled, you stood. If pressure arrived, you faced it. If you claimed loyalty, you proved it. Those unwritten rules began shaping behaviour across the group. They weren't spoken openly, but everyone understood them. Every away day became another test, not just against rivals, but against your own nerve. The reading trip marked the end of innocence for many involved. It was the point where firm life stopped being an idea and became a responsibility. And it wouldn't be long before another journey would push those lessons even further. A trip that would bring the MIGs face to face with serious opposition in an environment where tension would boil over into one of the early defining confrontations. That moment would arrive during an encounter involving Manchester City, an incident that would unfold inside a place known as the Sports Bar. And what happened there would leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Chapter 3. Manchester City. The Sports Bar. By the time the Manchester City trip came around, the MIGs were no longer learning the basics of away travel. They had already experienced the early lessons, the tension, the pressure, and the reality that words meant nothing without action. But Manchester City was different. This wasn't just another away day filled with nervous anticipation. There was an expectation that something serious might unfold. Word travelled quickly between firms in those days, and reputations carried weight. Manchester City had a presence of their own, and anyone travelling into their territory understood that respect had to be earned. The journey itself followed the familiar routine, meeting early, gathering numbers, making sure everyone knew the plan. There was always a sense of discipline in how the group moved. Loose organisation quickly became dangerous, so the focus remained on staying tight, staying aware, and staying together. Among the group that day were familiar figures: Windy, Flower, Trigger, Dennis, Black K, Scottish Brian, and others who had already proven themselves dependable when pressure arrived. As they entered the city, the mood shifted. There was a heaviness in the air that couldn't be ignored. Rival territory always brought tension, but Manchester felt sharper. There were more eyes watching, more movement, more awareness that something could happen without warning. The MIGs began moving through the area carefully, aware that any wrong step could spark confrontation. Every doorway, every side street, every unfamiliar face was studied. Experience had already taught them that the smallest detail could change everything. Eventually, attention turned toward a location known as the Sports Bar. It was the kind of place where opposing groups could cross paths unexpectedly or deliberately. Places like that carried an edge. They weren't neutral ground. They were pressure points, where tension could build quickly and explode without warning. As the MIGs approached, the atmosphere tightened. Inside the bar, the presence of Manchester City supporters became clear. There were numbers inside, enough to create tension immediately. No words were needed to understand what could unfold. Rival colours, rival faces, rival territory. Everything pointed toward confrontation. Moments like that happened quickly. 1 second you were assessing the room, reading body language, counting numbers. The next, movement began, sudden, sharp, unavoidable. What followed was chaos. Furniture shifted, voices rose, movement became instinctive. The confined space inside the bar turned the confrontation into something intense and immediate. There was no room to retreat, no chance to step back and reassess. Once it started, it unfolded at speed. For those inside, survival depended on awareness and reaction. Standing still wasn't an option. Every second mattered. The noise inside the bar built rapidly, shouting, crashing, movement from every direction. The atmosphere that had felt tense moments earlier now erupted into full confrontation. It was the kind of environment where instinct took over, where training and experience became the difference between control and collapse. For Tommy and the others, this was a defining moment. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about standing firm under pressure. The earlier lessons from Reading echoed in the background. This time, there was no hesitation among those who remained. Everyone present understood what was expected. You didn't step back. You didn't separate. You stayed with your group. Inside the chaos, individuals moved with purpose. The familiarity between members allowed them to react as one unit, adjusting to movement around them, protecting space where possible, and pushing forward when needed. Confined environments like bars carried their own dangers. There was nowhere to create distance, nowhere to regroup safely. Once the situation escalated, you were committed. Eventually, the confrontation began to shift. Momentum changed, movement slowed. The initial explosion of action gave way to controlled withdrawal. That moment, knowing when to disengage, was just as important as knowing when to stand firm. Leaving a hostile environment safely required discipline. The MIGs moved out together, keeping formation as they exited. Adrenaline still ran high, but control remained. Outside, the noise faded into distance, replaced by the heavy breathing and focused silence that followed intense confrontation. Once clear of the immediate threat, reality settled in. Moments like that stayed with you. They replayed in your mind every movement, every decision, every second that could have gone differently. Reflection became part of the process. It wasn't about celebration, it was about learning. For Tommy and the others, Manchester City became one of the first truly serious tests of the MIG's ability to operate under pressure. And the outcome carried consequences. Word of confrontations travelled quickly in those days. Stories spread between towns, between pubs, between terraces. What happened inside the sports bar didn't remain local knowledge for long. It became part of the growing reputation attached to the MIG name. Respect wasn't given freely. It was earned through moments like that. But reputation brought new attention from rivals, from police, and from those watching quietly from the sidelines. With each incident, the visibility of the group increased. And increased visibility meant increased risk. The Manchester City incident marked the beginning of a new phase. The MIGs were no longer just testing themselves, they were being tested by others who had heard their name and wanted to measure it against their own. What came next would take that pressure to another level. Bigger crowds, bigger rivalries, bigger risks. And among those looming encounters was one of the most talked about clashes in Tommy's story, a day involving Chelsea, Wembley and numbers, large enough to change the atmosphere entirely. It would become one of the most memorable confrontations of the era, and it would push the MIGs further into the spotlight than ever before. Chapter 4. Chelsea, Wembley, 94. By the mid-1990s, football had already begun to change in many ways, but the edge that surrounded big fixtures still remained. For firms across the country, certain matches carried more weight than others. Some days were circled on calendars long before kick-off, not because of the football itself, but because of the possibilities that surrounded it. The trip to Wembley in 1994 was one of those days. It carried tension long before anyone stepped onto a train or bus. Word had spread that large numbers would be travelling. Rival firms were expected to be present, and whenever that kind of movement took place, the atmosphere around the day changed completely. For the MIGs, preparation was everything. Movement had to be organised, meeting points arranged, numbers confirmed. Experience had already shown that disorganisation led to vulnerability. On days like this, survival depended on unity. The journey toward Wembley carried the usual mixture of noise and silence. Some laughed and joked to mask nerves. Others stayed quiet, watching the movement around them, already thinking ahead to what might unfold. Arriving in London always carried its own energy. The city moved differently from smaller towns. There were more people, more movement, more distractions, and more opportunities for confrontation. On major match days, the streets around Wembley became magnets for rival supporters, drawing groups into close proximity, whether planned or not. As the MIGs approached the Wembley area, the size of the crowd became obvious. Thousands moved through the streets. Police presence was visible, but even heavy policing couldn't remove the tension that hung over the day. Rival colours appeared across different areas, each group aware that contact was inevitable at some point. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. Among the MIGs, awareness sharpened. Movement slowed slightly as they approached key locations. Eyes stayed alert, scanning crowds for familiar faces or rival presence. Then came the moment when tension turned into action. Somewhere within the flow of supporters, rival numbers became clear. Movement shifted. Individuals adjusted positions instinctively, tightening formation, preparing for confrontation. Words were exchanged, but language was secondary. Body language told a real story. The first surge came quickly, crowds moved forward, closing distance. What had moments earlier been separate groups became one shifting mass of bodies. Noise built rapidly, shouting, movement, the unmistakable sound of confrontation spreading through a crowd. For those caught inside it, there was no space to hesitate. Everything moved fast. Momentum carried bodies forward, pushing individuals into direct contact, whether they intended it or not. In crowded environments like Wembley approaches, space disappeared instantly. Control became difficult. Awareness became survival. Tommy and the others moved with the group, reacting to movement rather than planning it. In situations like that, there was no time for discussion. Instinct ruled every second. The clash itself unfolded across a wide area. Movement pushed through streets, shifting positions, drawing police attention almost immediately. Officers moved in quickly, attempting to separate groups before things escalated further. But large numbers made control difficult. Crowds resisted movement. Noise increased. The atmosphere became chaotic, not confined to a single space like the Manchester City bar incident, but spread across open ground where movement came from every direction. Police presence intensified. Lines formed. Commands were shouted. Attempts were made to force separation between rival groups. Batons were visible. Movement slowed as pressure from law enforcement increased. But even as police worked to regain control, the energy within the crowd remained unpredictable. Individuals who had travelled long distances weren't easily dispersed. Pride, reputation, and loyalty carried weight on days like this. Eventually, control began to return. Movement slowed, groups separated. The immediate threat of confrontation faded, replaced by heavy breathing and watchful silence. For those involved, adrenaline still ran high, but the moment of chaos had passed. For Tommy and the MIGs, Wembley 1994 became one of the largest scale confrontations they had experienced. It wasn't just the size of the crowd that made it memorable, it was the intensity, the unpredictability, and the realization that large gatherings carried risks far beyond anything experienced in smaller towns. Days like that left lasting impressions. They reinforced lessons learned over years of travel and confrontation. They showed how quickly situations could escalate when large numbers collided. They reminded everyone involved that preparation and unity remained essential, no matter how experienced a firm became. But Wembley was only one chapter. There were more encounters ahead, some smaller in scale, but just as intense in execution. Some moments would unfold in unexpected places, away from the main stadiums, where confrontation could develop quietly before exploding without warning, not inside the ground, but at a location that would become remembered for its sudden eruption of violence. A railway station. Bushy. And what happened there would become another defining memory in Tommy's journey. Chapter 5. Watford. Bushy Station. Not every confrontation happened near stadiums. Some of the most dangerous moments unfolded far from the noise of terraces, in places where movement was restricted and escape routes were limited. Railway stations were among the most volatile locations. They were choke points, narrow platforms, enclosed walkways, and tight spaces where rival groups could collide without warning. Bushey Station, on the outskirts of Watford, became one of those places. The day had followed a familiar pattern up to that point. Travel had been planned, numbers gathered, and the usual awareness carried through every stage of the journey. Those who had been around long enough understood that railway stations were never neutral territory. They were locations where tension could build quietly before erupting without hesitation. As the MIGs approached Bushey, there was already movement around the platforms. Supporters from different areas were filtering through, each group keeping watch on the others. There was an unspoken understanding that confrontation could happen at any moment. You learned to read body language in those environments, the way people stood, the way they watched, the way groups gathered without speaking too loudly. Those were the signs that told you something was about to unfold. It didn't take long before the tension sharpened. Rival numbers became visible across the station area. The space between groups narrowed slightly as movement increased. People positioned themselves instinctively, tightening formation, staying close to those they trusted. Moments like that felt suspended in time. Everything slowed, even though movement was increasing. Conversations became shorter. Words were reduced to signals and glances. There was no need for long discussions. Everyone present understood what might happen next. Then it happened. Movement came suddenly. The distance between groups disappeared almost instantly as confrontation erupted across the platform. The confined nature of the station created immediate pressure. There was nowhere to spread out, nowhere to step back safely. The environment forced close contact. Noise filled the air, shouting, movement, the sharp sounds of bodies colliding in tight space. For those caught in the centre, survival depended on staying with the group. Separation in a confined location could quickly become dangerous. Experience had already taught the MIGs that unity meant protection. Losing sight of your own numbers meant vulnerability. The clash moved quickly along the platform. Bodies shifted back and forth, reacting to pressure from both sides. The confined space forced everyone into direct engagement. Movement became instinctive, adjusting positions, reacting to threats, maintaining awareness of surroundings at all times. Railway staff disappeared from view almost immediately. The moment confrontation began, normal station activity collapsed into chaos. The controlled environment that once felt routine became unpredictable in seconds. Police response followed soon after. Officers moved into position, pushing into the centre of the disturbance, attempting to regain control of the platform. The presence of authority forced movement to shift again. Confrontation began to break apart under pressure, but tension remained high. Disengagement in places like Bushey required discipline. It wasn't about running blindly, it was about controlled movement, staying tight, making sure no one was left exposed. Even as police presence increased, awareness remained sharp. Rival groups still lingered nearby, watching, waiting for opportunity. Eventually, separation occurred. Groups moved apart under pressure from officers. The platform, once filled with confrontation, began returning slowly to order. But the memory of what had unfolded remained sharp in the minds of those who had experienced it. For Tommy and the MIGs, Bushey Station became another defining moment. Not because of the scale, but because of the intensity. Confrontations in confined spaces carried risks that couldn't be ignored. They forced individuals to rely entirely on trust and discipline. There was no room for hesitation, no time to think through long decisions. Everything happened at speed. The lessons from Bushey carried forward into future encounters. Awareness of environment became second nature. Every location was studied, every route considered. Travel stopped being simple movement, it became tactical. But Bushey was only one piece of a much larger pattern. Across the country, rivalries were intensifying, names were becoming recognised. Stories travelled between towns and cities, shaping reputation before groups even arrived. With each confrontation, attention from both rivals and authorities increased. And one of the most intimidating environments waiting ahead would be a fixture involving Millwall, a club known across the country for the reputation of its supporters and the hostility that surrounded visits from outsiders. The journey into Millwall territory was never taken lightly, and what happened during one particular encounter there would show exactly why. Chapter 6. Millwall. The intimidation factor. There were certain fixtures that carried weight long before the day arrived. Not because of league position, not because of form, but because of reputation. Millwall was one of those places. Across the country, the name alone carried meaning. Stories travelled between firms, accounts of hostile welcomes, heavy numbers, and an environment that rarely favoured visiting sides. Whether exaggerated or not, those stories shaped expectation, and expectation shaped behaviour. For the MIGs, travelling to Millwall wasn't treated like any ordinary away day. Preparation began earlier than usual. Plans were discussed more carefully. Movement was organised with greater attention to detail. Nobody underestimated what waited there. The journey itself felt different. There was less joking, less noise. Even among experienced lads, Millwall carried an atmosphere that demanded focus. You didn't travel there expecting comfort. You travelled expecting hostility. And hostility was exactly what greeted visitors. Arriving in Millwall territory brought immediate awareness. The streets felt tighter. The movement of locals carried purpose. Groups gathered in ways that signalled ownership of territory. Even before confrontation, the environment itself felt like pressure. You felt watched, not always openly, but enough to remind you that you were an outsider. That knowledge sat in the back of your mind from the moment you arrived. The presence of Millwall supporters wasn't subtle. They held their ground confidently, moving through their own areas with familiarity and control. There was a clear sense that this was their territory, and anyone arriving from outside needed to be ready for whatever followed. For visiting firms, the challenge wasn't only physical, it was psychological. You had to control nerves, control breathing, control movement. Because once nerves showed, vulnerability followed. The MIGs stayed tight, moving as a unit through unfamiliar streets. Every turn was watched carefully. Every gathering of locals studied. Awareness was constant, not just of rivals, but of surroundings. It wasn't long before movement began to build. Groups appeared at distance. Individuals positioned themselves in visible locations. Words were exchanged across space, not always loudly, but enough to establish presence. It felt like the opening moves of a game, neither side rushing immediately, but both fully aware of the direction things were heading. Then came the moment where distance shortened. Movement began subtly, almost casually at first. A shift in position here, a tightening of numbers there, nothing explosive yet, but everything building. The pressure increased with every second. For those involved, reputation played a huge role in moments like this. Millwall's name alone carried expectation. Visiting firms knew they would be tested. Backing down wasn't an option, not without long-term consequences to reputation. So movement continued, closer, slower, more deliberate. The first surge came suddenly. It always did. What had been cautious positioning turned into rapid movement as confrontation erupted. Noise rose instantly, shouting, movement. The sound of bodies colliding as groups closed distance. Unlike the chaos of Wembley or the confined intensity of Bushey Station, Millwall carried a different feeling. There was purpose behind movement, confidence, familiarity. For the MIGs, staying organised was critical. Losing structure in hostile territory could quickly turn dangerous. Movement had to be controlled, awareness maintained even under pressure. Police presence followed quickly, as it often did in areas known for confrontation. Officers moved to separate groups, forcing distance where moments earlier there had been collision. But even as authority intervened, tension remained high. Millwall territory didn't lose its atmosphere easily. The hostility lingered even after separation, carried in the way people watched each other across distance. Eventually, movement broke apart. Groups withdrew under pressure from police, but not without leaving impression. Encounters at places like Millwall weren't always remembered for single explosive moments. They were remembered for the overall experience. The tension, the pressure, the sense that every step had been watched. For Tommy and the MIGs, the Millwall trip reinforced something important. Reputation mattered as much as numbers. In places where history ran deep, psychological strength carried just as much weight as physical presence. But even after facing environments like Millwall, there were still moments ahead that would test endurance in different ways. Not through territory, not through reputation, but through sheer, relentless confrontation, the kind that unfolded when rival firms met repeatedly over time, building tension through history rather than single events. One of those rivalries would bring the MIGs into repeated conflict with Manchester City supporters, encounters that would escalate over multiple meetings. And one of those meetings would stand out above the rest, not because of numbers alone, but because of the intensity that followed once confrontation began. Chapter 7. Manchester City, the running battles. Some rivalries weren't built in a single afternoon. They formed slowly over repeated encounters, each meeting adding weight to the last. Over time, names became familiar. Faces were remembered. The tension between groups stopped being random and became personal. Manchester City became one of those rivalries. Encounters between the MIGs and City supporters didn't happen once and disappear into memory. They happened again and again, each meeting reinforcing the next. Word travelled both ways. Stories passed between towns, shaping expectation long before anyone boarded a train. Everyone knew what to expect when City was involved. Movement, numbers, pressure, and above all, resistance. One particular trip to Manchester would become one of the most memorable of them all. The journey north followed a familiar rhythm. Early starts, organised movement, and constant awareness that arrival would bring immediate tension. Travelling into Manchester always carried a different kind of energy. It wasn't simply about football, it was about history between groups. By the time the MIGs arrived, the atmosphere was already charged. City supporters were known for their numbers, and on days like this, those numbers made themselves visible early. Groups gathered across key areas, holding positions that made their presence impossible to ignore. For visiting firms, this created immediate pressure. You could feel it building before anything happened. The streets became observation points, windows, corners, open spaces, every location offered vantage. Rival presence wasn't hidden. It was displayed deliberately, signalling readiness. Then movement began. Not all at once, but gradually. Small groups shifted first. Individuals repositioned themselves. Lines tightened. Those experienced in these environments recognized the pattern instantly. It was the build-up that always came before the first real surge. And once it began, it didn't stop easily. The first clash happened quickly. Distance closed with speed, and what had been scattered groups turned into one concentrated movement. Noise filled the air, shouting, footsteps pounding against pavement, bodies colliding as momentum took hold. But this wasn't a single burst of confrontation. It turned into something else entirely. Running battles. Movement didn't stay fixed in one location. Instead, it shifted through streets, moving from one area to another as groups pushed and retreated repeatedly. What began as one clash became a chain reaction across multiple spaces. For those involved, endurance became as important as strength. You weren't simply reacting once, you were reacting again and again. Each surge carried fresh pressure. Each retreat carried risk. Movement required awareness, not only of rivals, but of surroundings, escape routes, and the growing presence of police. Manchester streets became a maze. Turning corners meant uncertainty. Every junction carried the possibility of renewed confrontation. Even moments of temporary separation felt tense, because everyone knew the next collision could happen at any second. Police presence increased rapidly. Sirens echoed through the streets as officers attempted to regain control. Vehicles moved into position. Lines formed across roadways, forcing groups apart wherever possible. But running battles didn't stop immediately. Even as police pressure grew, movement continued in bursts, short, intense confrontations followed by rapid repositioning. The environment itself made full control difficult. Narrow streets, side roads, and open spaces created constant opportunity for re-engagement. For Tommy and the MIGs, this became one of the most physically demanding encounters they had experienced. Fatigue began to play a role. Breathing grew heavier. Movement slowed slightly. Adrenaline carried people forward, but exhaustion followed close behind. In running battles, stamina separated those who endured from those who fell behind, and falling behind carried risk. Separation from your group created vulnerability. Experience had already taught the importance of staying connected, especially in unfamiliar territory, where numbers could shift rapidly. Eventually, police pressure began to take effect. Movement slowed, routes were blocked. Separation between groups increased. The running nature of the confrontation began to break apart, replaced by scattered movement and heavy police presence across key areas. Control returned gradually, but the memory remained vivid. For Tommy and the MIGs, Manchester City encounters became defining moments, not because of a single clash, but because of the repeated nature of conflict between the groups. Rivalry wasn't built overnight. It was forged through repetition, through memory, through shared history of confrontation. Each meeting added to reputation. Each clash strengthened identity. But even after multiple encounters with Manchester City, there were still moments ahead that would test resilience in entirely different ways. Not always through planned confrontation, sometimes through sudden, unpredictable escalation, the kind that happened when circumstances shifted without warning, leaving little time to prepare. One such moment would unfold during another major gathering, when numbers were high, tension was thick, and control disappeared in seconds. And when that happened, survival depended not on strength alone, but on experience. Chapter 8. Escalation, when control disappears. Up to that point, most confrontations follow familiar patterns: movement, tension, contact, separation. Even in the chaos, there was usually some sense of structure, some level of awareness that allowed groups to anticipate what might happen next. Experience gave you tools to manage pressure. But sometimes, structure vanished completely. Sometimes, control disappeared. And when that happened, everything became unpredictable. One particular gathering stood out because of how quickly it spiraled beyond expectation. It began like many others: organized travel, familiar faces, the usual mixture of confidence and underlying tension. Nothing unusual at first, nothing to suggest that the day would unfold differently from countless others before it. But warning signs were there. Small details that only became obvious later, larger numbers than expected, unfamiliar faces mixing into the crowd, movement that felt slightly off. Those who had spent years around these environments often sensed when things were shifting, even if they couldn't explain exactly why. The location filled quickly. Crowds gathered faster than anticipated. Movement became tighter. Space disappeared as more people arrived, pressing groups closer together, whether they intended to or not. Noise built steadily. Not from confrontation at first, but from sheer density. Voices overlapping, movement increasing, tension building beneath the surface, like pressure inside a sealed container. Then something changed. It didn't happen gradually. It happened all at once. A sudden surge, movement from one direction, triggering reaction from another. The kind of moment where no single individual controlled what followed. Momentum took over, pulling everyone into the center, whether they were ready or not. And once momentum began, stopping it became nearly impossible. Bodies pushed forward, space collapsed, noise erupted into shouting, movement, impact. The unmistakable sounds of confrontation spreading through tightly packed space. What had moments earlier been controlled movement turned into uncontrolled collision. For those inside it, awareness became survival. There was no room for hesitation. no time to think through decisions. Everything moved too fast. Reaction replaced planning. Instinct replaced strategy. The environment itself added danger. Objects became obstacles. Barriers created choke points. Movement slowed in places where pressure built from behind, forcing individuals into positions they couldn't easily escape. You could feel the panic beginning to spread, not everywhere, but enough to shift the tone. Some people moved with confidence. Others reacted with uncertainty. In chaotic environments, that difference mattered. Panic created vulnerability, and vulnerability spread risk through the crowd. Police presence intensified almost immediately. Sirens cut through noise as officers moved into position from multiple directions. Lines formed quickly, attempting to push movement apart before injuries escalated further. But separating large numbers in confined space wasn't simple. Movement resisted control. Crowds surged again and again, reacting unpredictably as pressure shifted across the environment. Even trained officers struggled to impose order when momentum had already taken hold. For Tommy and the MIGs, this moment carried a different kind of lesson. It wasn't about rivalry, it wasn't about territory, it was about chaos. Pure, uncontrolled chaos. The kind that reminded everyone involved that even the most experienced individuals could be overwhelmed when numbers grew too large and structure disappeared. Eventually, exhaustion began to slow movement. Energy drained. Breathing grew heavier. Police lines strengthened, forcing distance between groups that moments earlier had been locked together. Gradually, control returned, but the aftermath told its own story. Debris scattered across the ground, faces marked with exhaustion, movement slower now, cautious, measured. The adrenaline that had driven action minutes earlier faded into fatigue. Moments like that stayed with you, not because of victory or defeat, but because of the realization that sometimes survival depended on luck as much as preparation. And that understanding changed perspective. For Tommy and many others, it marked a turning point, a moment where the risks became clearer than ever before, where the thrill of confrontation collided with the reality of consequences. Because the longer time passed, the harder it became to ignore what those consequences might be. Police attention increased, surveillance improved, arrests became more frequent. And with every passing year, the environment around football began to change. What had once been common became harder to sustain, and slowly, the world that had shaped years of movement and confrontation began to shift. Chapter 9. By the mid to late 1990s, the landscape around football had begun to change, not overnight, not suddenly, but steadily, year after year. Where once movement had felt open and unpredictable, there was now increasing control. Authorities were no longer reacting after incidents, they were preparing before they happened. The days of large, spontaneous gatherings were becoming harder to sustain, and everyone involved could feel it. Police presence became more visible at every stage of travel. Stations that once felt loosely controlled were now heavily monitored. Officers stood in greater numbers. Movement routes were restricted. Groups were guided, watched, and separated long before they reached stadiums. Surveillance increased as well. Cameras began appearing in places where previously there had been none. Entry points, walkways, transport hubs, all watched more closely than ever before. The sense of anonymity that had once existed started to fade. Faces were remembered, names were recorded, patterns were tracked. For those involved in firm culture, this created a new kind of pressure, one that didn't come from rivals, but from constant observation. It changed behaviour. Where once travel had been organised openly, it now required more caution. Routes were reconsidered. Meeting points changed more frequently. Communication became more discreet. But even with those adjustments, the risks increased. Arrests became more common. Individuals who had travelled freely for years suddenly found themselves facing legal consequences. Court appearances became part of the routine for some. Bans from football grounds began appearing more frequently, restricting movement and forcing individuals to rethink how they engage with the game. For many, this marked the beginning of a slow shift. Not away from loyalty, but away from the lifestyle that had defined their younger years. Responsibilities began to grow outside football. Work became more important. Family life entered the picture. Priorities shifted gradually. What once felt like permanent routine began to feel temporary. For Tommy and others within the MIGs, these changes were impossible to ignore. Each year brought tighter restrictions. Each season introduced new policing tactics designed to prevent the kinds of gatherings that had once been common. Even matchday atmospheres changed. Stadium environments became more controlled. Seating arrangements replaced standing areas. Entry procedures grew stricter. The raw unpredictability that had once defined terraces began to fade. For those who had lived through earlier years, it felt like the closing of an era. Not completely gone, but undeniably different. There were still confrontations, still movement, still tension, but nothing like before. The scale reduced, the frequency declined, the environment became less forgiving to those who continued to push boundaries. Every decision carried greater risk than it once had. And with greater risk came reflection. Moments of quiet began to matter more than moments of chaos. Conversations shifted from planning movement to remembering it. Stories were retold, not just as bragging rights, but as reminders of what had once been possible. There was pride in those memories, but there was also realism. Because by that stage, everyone involved understood something important. The world around football had changed permanently, and the lifestyle that once defined their youth could not continue unchanged forever. For Tommy, those years left lasting marks, not just physical, but mental. Lessons learned through pressure. Friendships formed through shared experience. Memories created in moments where survival depended on trust. All of it remained, even as the environment around football moved into a new era. And as time passed, reflection became unavoidable. Not regret, not glorification, reflection on what had been gained, on what had been lost, and on how those years had shaped the person who remained when the noise faded. Chapter 10. Reflection. Brotherhood, loyalty, and and the end of an era. Time has a way of changing everything, not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, year by year. For those who lived through the height of the firm years, the passage of time brought distance from the chaos that once defined weekends. The noise faded. The movement slowed. The routines that had once felt permanent gradually became memories. But the memories never disappeared. They stayed clear, sharp, and impossible to forget. Looking back, what stood out most wasn't always the confrontations themselves. It wasn't the locations, the rivalries, or even the scale of the moments that made the deepest impact. It was the people, the lads you stood beside, the ones who travelled with you week after week, the ones you trusted when things turned unpredictable. That was the real foundation of everything. Brotherhood. Not the kind spoken about lightly, but the kind formed through shared risk, shared pressure, and shared experience. The kind that built loyalty stronger than ordinary friendships. Because when you stood shoulder to shoulder with the same group of people again and again, trust stopped being optional. It became survival. For Tommy, the years with the MIGs weren't just about movement or confrontation. They were about belonging, being part of something that felt bigger than the individual, something that carried identity, pride, and reputation. That sense of belonging stayed long after the movement stopped. As years passed, life shifted. Work took priority. Families formed. Responsibilities replaced routines that once revolved around match days. The adrenaline faded, replaced by reflection. Looking back at those years brought mixed emotion, pride in what had been endured, awareness of risks that had been taken, and recognition of how different life had become. Football itself changed as well. Stadiums modernised, security tightened, crowds became more controlled. The terraces that once felt raw and unpredictable evolved into something entirely different. For those who remembered earlier days, it sometimes felt like watching the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened. An era ended, not with a single moment, but through gradual transformation. And yet, despite everything that changed, certain things remained untouched. The friendships, the memories, the sense of identity shaped during those years. Even decades later, stories from those days still carried weight. Conversations returned to familiar moments, journeys taken, risks faced, and the times when trust between individuals made the difference between safety and vulnerability. Those memories formed part of who they became, not just as individuals, but as men shaped by experience. Looking back now, the years with the MIG stood as a defining period in Tommy's life. A time of intensity, pressure, loyalty, and constant movement. A time when decisions were made quickly, consequences followed immediately, and survival depended on unity. It wasn't a life without risk. It wasn't a life without consequence, but it was a life that left lasting marks, not always visible, but deeply felt. And as time moved forward, the importance of those years became clearer. Not because of what happened on specific days, but because of what remained afterward. The bonds, the loyalty, the understanding that no matter how much the world changed, those who stood together during the hardest moments would always carry that connection. Even when the noise stopped, even when the crowds disappeared, even when the era itself became history. Because in the end, what lasted wasn't the confrontation. It was the brotherhood. And for those who lived through it, that brotherhood became the one thing time could never erase. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this original story, never been heard on YouTube before. To listen to more original stories like this, please click the subscribe and like button. You will be notified of when I put out a new video. It also helps to support the channel. And it's free. See you next time.